Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy for the Takshashila Institution. My name is Sachin Kalbag. It is no secret that India-US relations have grown rapidly in the last 20 years. The partnership is often described as a comprehensive global strategic partnerships. Many other adjectives have been used to describe the ties: the most consequential, indispensable, natural allies, the defining partnership of the 21st century, a force for good, for global peace and stability. The two countries share a very close relationship and, of course, close defense ties as well. Then the US is India's largest trading partner and foreign direct investor. Shared democratic values, the convergence of interests on various issues, and vibrant people-to-people contacts drive the relationship. But this apparent bonhomie was, of course, not always the case. Observers and students will remember that Cold War era suspicions, between the US and India, which lasted till the end of the last century, have been overcome now, but they were quite evident to people there back then, and diplomats, of course, were trying hard to overcome them. India was, of course, a target of US sanctions over its nuclear program immediately after the 1970s, when then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi decided to go ahead with India's nuclear program. And then there was the US support for Pakistan. India, of course, pursued a non-aligned policy, but covertly and on most occasions overtly leaned towards the Soviet Union, or the USSR as it was known then. It became the primary source of its military equipment. This dependency, with Russia being the USSR's successor state, has persisted. In 2004, India and the US announced the next steps in strategic partnership, that's NSSP, to expand cooperation in civil nuclear activities, civilian space program, and high technology trade. This was followed by the 10-year new framework for US-India defense relations in 2005. Over the last many years, India has tried to, and of course the US too, has tried to bridge the gaps between the relations between the two countries. The acceptance of India as a responsible state with advanced nuclear technology. The US has said this often. And of course, India's Prime Minister Modi has said in his address to the US Congress that the US-India relations are a game changer in the 21st century. He said that the US support for India changed the very colors of the leaves of our relationship. India's Foreign Minister Jaishankar has also articulated that if you were to ask me in these years what has been the most remarkable change in how India views the world in terms of relationships, I think there is no question it is our relationship with the United States. Although India's relations with the US have grown substantially, suspicions remain within certain quarters of the Indian public intelligentsia. These individuals tend to argue that the US is fundamentally an unreliable partner. To make this case, they point to the history of US-India relations. But today I have with me Yusuf Unjhawala, my colleague at Takshashila Institution. He's a scholar on defense and strategic studies and is currently working on research topics based on these subjects. He has written an important paper which will be published this week on why the US-India relationship matters and why the skeptics are often wrong on most counts. Yusuf, welcome to All Things Policy.
Thanks, Sachin. Great to be here.
Thank you. We'll dive right in. How would you describe the current state of India-US strategic relations? I know that in your paper you have extensively covered this topic. But for this podcast, do you think it is purely transactional, or would you say that it is a lot deeper than that? Given that people-to-people contacts and Indian-American participation in US business and politics is rising significantly, what is your assessment, rather, of this relationship?
I don't think it is transactional. I think it has grown deeper in the last 20 years or 25 years since Prime Minister Vajpayee initiated the talks with the US soon after the nuclear test. I don't think India believes in transactional relationship as such. We want deeper ties, and obviously within that there can be a bit of transactionalism, which is there. But overall, we prefer deeper engagement countries so that the full potential of the relations can be realized. Very recently, Foreign Minister Jaishankar said, India does not believe in transactional relationship. We balance our values with our interests, and that's how we pursue our foreign relations. So I don't think India-US relations are transactional. It's far deeper. Although during the Cold War, we did not have the best of relations, but we did have a lot of people-to-people contact. People from India moved to the US in search of better economic opportunities. So that kind of laid the foundations. I think it's a very important aspect. The diaspora, which is there in the US, which is over 40 lakhs, is a source of strength for both countries. In India, Indians contribute a lot to the US economy. And for India, it has been a source of remittance. But now it is kind of a source of better relations, especially at the government level, with a lot of Indians, diaspora, or people of Indian origin in the US administration. So I don't think it is transactional. There is a bit of transactionalism within the overall relation, but the relations have strengthened, have been deeper.
Yeah, I mean, in that context, I'm glad that you brought up Atal Bihari Vajpayee's prime ministership, and during that time, there were steps taken to bridge the gaps. In that context, would you say that the signing of the 123 agreement into law in 2006 was that the inflection point from which the relationship really took off in the 21st century, or would you point to something else as the turning point for the relationship?
No, I think it was a turning point. There is absolutely no doubt that the nuclear deal was a turning point of our ties. Even Prime Minister Modi referred to that and says, that changed the very colors of our relationship. So there is absolutely no doubt that the signing of that agreement laid the basis for where our relationship is there today. If you just notice a trend, in 2005 there was this agreement signed, the framework of India-US ties, and then the 123 agreement was signed. And then in 2008, India signed its first significant defense deal with the US, which was for the C-130 aircraft. From between the Cold War era till 2008, there was hardly any defense trade. But you just see that if you just match the timelines, it's just about then. Once the deal for the nuclear deal was signed, that's opened the floodgates for defense trade, because that kind of signal to India that the US was ready to, go from its past where it asked India to, roll back your nuclear and missile program, sign the CTBT and, sign the NPT and stuff like that, which was a kind of a no-go for India, was just not happening. And that stuck the ties to where it were, without realizing the great potential that existed between the two largest democracies in the world. And all those shackles were broken once the deal was signed. Although the deal itself has not generated anything out, neither for the US or for India. So there's no multi-billion-dollar deals for US nuclear reactors. But just that deal, the US pulling its weight, asking even China at that time to, give us a clean waiver at the NSG. NSG was formed after India's test in 1974 to deny us technology. So to get us into that, the clean waiver was a very significant thing, which kind of signaled that we are ready to now work with India. So it was definitely the most important point in Indo-US relations.
And given the background of September 11, 2001, and following the US getting more and more deep into understanding Pakistan's support for terrorism, not only in the region, but also global terrorism, do you think that, that brought in a lot of cynicism amongst the American, think tanks, intelligentsia, policymakers who looked at Pakistan differently after 2000, and this kind of helped the US come closer to India?
Yes, if you see the previous decade, which is the 1990s, when Indian economy was not doing well and Pakistan-sponsored or Pakistani terrorism is what I would put it as, was at its peak. We had a very troubled time in Kashmir. There were some who said that we nearly lost Kashmir. We just saved ourselves very, it was a very precarious situation at that time. Our economy also was not doing well. There were sanctions on us. And there was no sympathy for India, although we kept complaining that, look, this is terrorism, it is affecting us. But there was no sympathy. But once 9/11 happened, when terror hit America in its home, that is when they started to understand. And they were obviously linked with the Saudis, with the Pakistanis. The links then came up, and then there was a better appreciation for what India was saying, even what Pakistan was doing in Afghanistan with the support of Taliban. Because if you notice that, once the Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan, that's when the terror in Kashmir started. So it's all, handled by the ISI. And then it became more apparent to the US. And by the time the relations had already started to, because of the just one target talks, I think it was far better understanding of what India was going through. And then we offered support to the US after 9/11. We offered them our basis for refueling, and that kind of change. And that's why in 2004 we had a deal. Before that, we signed the general agreement as well. I think it was in 2003. It's step by step. We've seen a very steady uptick in relations.
Yeah, in your paper, Yusuf, you've described several of the points that the skeptics raise as quote unquote valid. For instance, the US will not supply us critical technologies, or the US weapon systems will not fit into our existing systems. Why do you think that many of the arguments that are forwarded by the skeptics are actually valid, but are kind of unfounded in reality? Do you think that in the long term, the US-India relationship will overcome all these tactical issues and build on its strategic foundations?
So you said it right. So once there is a strategic clarity as to what India-US relations stand for. I mean, we are not even calling them just our strategic relationship. We're calling it comprehensive global strategic partnership. We consider Indo-US partnership as something which has deep, impact for the globe, for the world. So our relationships matter. So then whatever happens within that is something then which can be addressed in a very pragmatic manner, keeping the overall picture in mind. So, something like technology sharing, and I've written about it in some of the other pieces, which I have been critical of at the pace at which the technology sharing has moved. But as far as the US is concerned, all its technologies are with the private sector, which is going to guard its technology. It's not going to give away because it wants to retain its monopoly over those kind of technologies.
Right.
And it's economic, right? They'll keep milking that technology forever. So it's unlike, say, for Russia, which is not a democratic country, which is state-controlled defense companies, and they can choose what they want to do and what they not want to do. Even there, the Russians have not shared all kinds of critical technology. I mean, if that was the case, they have been quote-unquote sharing technologies since the 1960s, with the MiG-21s. Why haven't we been able to make, say, a jet engine with all the technology sharing that has happened? Then certain part is that they will not share all the technologies, and then there has to be capability within India to absorb those technologies. We have to have that kind of industrial capability to replicate those technologies. But even China so far has not managed to, fully develop a good jet engine, although it has been reverse engineering Russian engines for a long time. But then it is not a deal breaker. I mean, can we do a lot better? Of course, we can do a lot better. That is what I've written in my paper as well. There are certain aspects of defense trade which have not lived up to the hype, because something like a defense trade and technology initiative was signed in 2012. So it's 10 years and there is not a single deliverable as far as that is concerned. Overall relationship growth today, a lot more has happened, since, Xi Jinping decided, it's no more hide and bide, and we are going to displace the US, very overtly announcing that they want to be, the greatest power on earth. And, then they did Doklam, and then 2020 Galwan pandemic hit, and things have just very rapidly changed. And that has obviously brought India and US even further closer. And now with the war in Ukraine, in my opinion, India's weight has increased in this region even more.
Yeah, absolutely. But given the strategic relationship that India had with the USSR then, and then, of course, after the breakup with Russia, two important deals that were, talked about in the media and in diplomatic circles was Admiral Gorshkov and the BrahMos collaboration. Given that background, and given the fact that India wants to have advanced technology from the US as well, and is exploring even French technology. I mean, we have had Mirage 2000, of course, but now with Rafale coming in, all these deals are happening, or at least the conversations are happening simultaneously. How does one kind of reconcile all these issues in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war as well? Because the US has consistently opposed it, but India has remained non-committal even at the United Nations. So given this background, how do you think Indian diplomats should or will collaborate with the Americans?
I think India's position on Ukraine is very clear. It's not that we support Russia, and it's not even that we are neutral. Our vote in the UN does not adequately, cover what our position is. You have to read all the statements. We are very consistently opposed any unilateral change in status quo, because that affects us as well with China. We want territorial integrity, sovereignty of all countries, rule of law, UN Charter, everything. It's just that we don't vote, against countries in a critical manner, which kind of leaves door open for negotiation. Today, India is perhaps the best place to, if at all there is any mediation required. I think India is the best place because we have relations with Russia. We have decent relations with Ukraine, although they are not happy with our position in the UN in terms of how we have voted, but we have provided them humanitarian assistance. Their deputy foreign minister was in India just a few days ago, and we have offered even more humanitarian assistance. So I think that part is very clear. Where this war is affecting us is on our own defense preparations. We use Russian weapons, which have not done well in the Ukraine war, which is kind of cause of concern for India, although I think it's more about how the Russians have used the war, their tactics, their training. They're using conscripts, whereas we have a professional army and our training methods are probably a lot more different than how the Russians train. But the biggest concern for us is what about the spares for this giant inventory of Russian weapons that we have got? And that is kind of dictated even how we have, spoken to Russia about this war, because we depend on them for spares. And right now we have locked in a conflict with China and we cannot afford to tick the Russians off, because if they stop the supply of spares, then we have a big problem. But having said that, the Russians are still not able to supply us spares. I mean, very recently we had a parliamentary standing committee report where it's very clearly stated that the Russians are not being able to deliver the spares on time. And it's pretty obvious, right? They have their own needs. They have been losing men, material in Ukraine, and they are going to address their needs first before they come to us. And moreover, the sanctions on Russia is preventing them from, access to chips, advanced chips. And that causes even more concern for us because they start to depend on China for these electronics. And imagine having those electronics in the weapons that Russia supplies to India. I mean, that is a serious security concern for us.
Absolutely.
So the Ukraine war is playing out for us in this negative manner in terms of how our defense relationship with Russia goes, especially their weapons. And that is the reason now we are very vocal about Atman and self-reliance and diversification away from Russia, because it is hitting us home really very hard.
Yes, in that sense, the Atman campaign is more than just rhetoric, isn't it? I mean, because we are trying to build our own indigenous defense industrial military complex.
Of course. And not only that, I mean, as a major power, defense sales are a diplomatic tool, right? I mean, defense sales are used to enhance your influence. They are used to, attain foreign policy objectives. So India lacking in that space, it's a tool away from our kit, right? Because we don't have weapons to offer. Although that is changing now. We recently had a deal with Philippines to supply the BrahMos. We have supplied to Armenia. And that has a very important context, right? Because our relation with Turkey is not that good. Turkey keeps, fingering us in the UN about Kashmir and stuff like that. And Azerbaijan is someone who is very hostile to India on the international stage again, and they are locked in a conflict with Armenia. So our supplies to Armenia makes a lot of sense. We have supplied howitzers, we have supplied multi-barrel rockets. Before that, we have supplied some radar equipment, weapon locating radar. So we do now, at least now we have a few platforms which have matured in the last 15, 20 years, and we do have something to offer to the world, especially in those who are not able to afford the very expensive weapons from the West. So we are offering a much cheaper solution. Yeah, that materializes well for us in the future.
On that note, Yusuf, will take a short break. We'll come back soon.
Sure.
Yusuf, before the break, you were talking about how India's conflict with China, although it's not, of course, a full-scale war, but there are skirmishes along the border, along the LAC, both in Arunachal Pradesh and in Ladakh. There are issues that China keeps talking about, renaming villages and cities in Arunachal Pradesh, renaming islands in the Indian Ocean. In that context, India's collaboration with America vis-a-vis real-time monitoring technologies, real-time spy technologies, these are really helping India thwart Chinese advances, and using this as as a foundation for a new kind of defense collaboration between US and India. Where do you think this relationship is going in that sense? Because in your paper, you do talk about how in the past Indians were, worried about Americans spying on us, and of course Americans were, skeptical about transferring technologies. But even especially on communications, But given that those communications technologies have been utilized in real time in India, by India vis-a-vis China, how do you think that is progressing, and why do you think this is important for taking the US-India relationship to the next level?
I think that's the very obvious collaboration which is happening. India is not going to get into kind of, NATO Article 5 like alliance with the US. We are not going to fight anybody's wars, but collaboration in the intelligence field, information sharing is very, very critical. And that's the reason why the defense agreements were signed. We have a logistic agreement, we have the communications agreement with them. And this is very critical for India because it helps us plug the very huge gaps that are there in our own ability to gather information. Right. So the Americans have been providing us information from, if you have a submarine that sails from the South China Sea and coming towards India, I mean, they have their surveillance, system, say a P8 from the US or even the Australian P8 who's monitoring over there. And now we have our own P8s. And because of this communication agreement, we are able to, in real time share data. So, if you have some Chinese ships or something sailing from there, we will know in advance that, something like this happening, and then we can take over once they come to this side of the region, which is once they cross the Malacca or something like that. Or if you are in a real situation, right, if we have to block ships in the Malacca,
right,
because it's
right.
a choke point, this information come very handy. Even in the northern borders, I mean, we have very limited capacity to monitor what's happening across. And the US has helped us. I mean, they have been very vocal. They've been saying that, we are very actively helping India with such information. And it is very critical. It's like a force multiplier for us.
In the past, of course, given that the US has supported, Pakistan, even during the 1971, war of Bangladesh liberation, we've had instances where the US Navy was present in the Indian Ocean. And therefore, there was this entire image thing that the US will not support India when it comes to strategic concerns. But now that seems to be changing, given that the two countries have collaborated, or at least are seen to be collaborating very, very actively on intelligence gathering vis-a-vis China. But this is again because the US itself isn't some sort of conflict with China over global supremacy, over its industry, over chip making. So, since all of these are kind of related, once these are overcome, the skeptics say that the US may go back and continue its indifference, or rather bring back the indifference that it had in the 1970s against India. Is that what your assessment is?
No. I mean, but Pakistan was helped by the US in 1971 it's very generally used by everybody. I mean, you can't hold relations hostage to the past. We look at a trend in the last 20 years. I mean, there are multiple statements from India and the US, swearing by our ties. I mean, the very first adjective given to our relation was Prime Minister Vajpayee when he said we are natural allies. And since then, it has taken off. We have given all kinds of names to our relation. It does matter. And if you look at it this way, I mean, the new Cold War has started. Some people prefer to not call it a Cold War, say we're not there yet. But I mean, in some form or the other, it is a repeat of what happened in the last century with the great power competition. Yes, there is more interlinkage between these two great powers right now. But we are seeing, the first signs of, they call it decoupling, or you call it China plus one or whatever. And these are our opportunities. And and it's not going to go away in the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years. And this is, China has decided that, by 2047, we want to displace the US. So you have a great 25, 30 years, time frame. It's for India to utilize. The great powers are competing, and it is our opportunity. That's why I call it, we have a great strategic opportunity to develop ourselves, because ultimately our goal is to become economically developed. And the US is a great technological power. It has a lot of capital. It remains the most advanced country in the world, and we have to utilize that for our own benefit. So all this doesn't matter in the sense what the US, I mean, they have repeatedly said that, the rise of India is in their interest. I mean, you can't keep repeatedly saying and you still be skeptical about it. I mean, it's over different administration. It is bipartisan over there. It is in their benefit. I mean, obviously, they are not doing it for some, very saintly reasons. And nobody does anything on the global stage for any other reason apart from their own national self-interest. That is the reason why we call convergence of interests, where there are interests converge, utilize for each other's best interest.
Yeah, in that
we have
sense,
to exploit our partnership with the US for the best.
In that sense, the AUKUS collaboration, the transfer of nuclear submarines to Australia, or the growing importance of the Quad, India, Australia, Japan, and the US. These two important developments seem to kind of indicate that the US is trying to counter China's growth using its natural allies such as Australia, but also allies or newfound allies such as India, and burying the indifference of the past and building on the relationship that, as you pointed out, of the last 20 years, especially on defense and strategic ties to counter China's growth.
I think the biggest indicator from that is it shows that the power of US is limited now. It's not uncontested. We know that China is contesting that, but the US is mighty stretched. And the war in Ukraine has further stretched out, right? Earlier, they want to pivot to Asia under Obama, and then now you have the Indo-Pacific strategy. And now you have the war in Ukraine, and US is committed towards securing Europe as well. That's diversion of resources and not total focus in the Pacific, where, I mean, the whole 21st century, this is the main contested area, right? The Indo-Pacific.
Right.
And that stretches the US even more. It has realized that. So when it transfers nuclear submarine to its ally, Australia, it is just telling Australia that, you have to share, you have to spend money, we'll give you the technology, and you take care of this area. And this is what helps India as well, right? I mean, there was a long time we hated the US for being the policeman of the world, but now we realize that it helps us as well.
Right.
And if we are able to, kind of say that, this is our area of responsibility, where I say the Indian Ocean region is ours, and you are free to take care of China on the other side of the Western Pacific. It helps the US because if you see its Navy, I mean, the Chinese Navy is far bigger now in terms of numbers than the US Navy, although the US Navy still remains the most powerful Navy in the world. But it is stretched. It can't be all over the place. So India coming in, it's a huge advantage for them. They don't have to worry about, the Indian Ocean and the trade that passes through. I mean, we ourselves say that we want to be the net security provider. And these are the opportunities for us. I mean, that is what brings us closer. And ultimately, we have to derive economic benefit from it. We have to get technology, investments. And that's what we are doing, right? With say, companies like Apple, semiconductor industry. We want all that set up in India. Apart from that, generally, make in India, in whichever field. We need all that because we need to provide employment to the crores of youth who come enter the workforce every year.
In India, there is this, because India is still one of the key providers of technology talent to the US. There is also this argument in favor of building this people to people contact and the growing importance of Indian Americans in American government. Every week, we hear of one new Indian American who's been appointed to some key committee or to the elected to the US Congress or appointed to the Biden administration. Last count, there were more than 40 Indian Americans in the Biden administration. This is unheard of, in the 1980s or even the 1990s. Given this kind of backdoor entry into American administration, the Indian American influence is only increasing, and perhaps the importance of India as a key provider of talent, whether it is political talent or technological talent, is growing in terms of understanding and growing in terms of appreciation, even amongst those who were skeptics earlier.
Yes, and as far as back as in 2001, I think the MEA in one of its documents said that Indian diaspora is an asset for us, and it provides us great, political heft. This is 20 years ago when the relation was just beginning to, take a trajectory up in the upward direction. So diaspora over there plays a very important role. We have been trying to increase our engagement with diaspora, people of Indian origin, even NRIs who settle in the US or around the world. There is no doubt that is a very important aspect of our foreign policy, engaging with a diaspora.
But
there's no question about that.
How would you respond to, people? I know that you've raised this important point in your paper, but just to elaborate on that, how do you respond to people who say that India will not be able to have its independent positions on various international issues if it becomes, or at least is seen to be getting closer to the US? This has happened with other US allies as well. Even in the United Nations, other US allies have voted in conjunction with how the US votes. But over the last few years, India has shown a little bit of independence, saying that we will have our own position on various issues, including at the Security Council, including other UN bodies. How would you respond to that?
There was a study done in 2019 or something like that, which showed India's voting position vis-a-vis the US, what the US voted for the resolution or against the resolution, and how India voted. India was right at the bottom, at the opposite spectrum. We've always had a position which was in variance with the US. And we're talking from data from, say, about 2001 till 2019, when the relations have been going on an upswing, despite Quad or whatever. We have maintained our independent position based on our interests. Even on this war in the Ukraine, we have voted in a certain manner, although our position is very clear that we don't support a war. And when it comes to voting, we maintain our position. So it just shows that India is able to, where it matters, we are not going to compromise on anything. I mean, it's as simple as that. Ultimately, a partnership is for mutual benefit. So where interests converge, we will collaborate in a manner. Yeah, everything is good. So let us get together and get going. But if there are differences, we'll manage it. I think we have shown that pragmatism, right? If you look at all the statements, even from the US, soon after the war started, and people started saying, what, India is buying oil from Russia, India is buying weapons from Russia. And these guys said, what, we did not support India when it needed it. And now we are ready to offer that support. And they realize that, right? So, I mean, you can't wish away something, which has built over some 40, 50 years, something like our weapons dependency on Russia. And we bought oil from Russia. And then once they realized that India buying oil from Russia was actually good for them, they have stopped talking about it. I mean, initially we were threatened by the US saying that, there'll be consequences if you buy oil from Russia. That was then. And now today, I think we bought nearly $25-30 billion worth of oil from Russia at discounted price, even below the cap that the West has imposed on Russia.
Yes.
And it has helped us. I mean, there is stabilized price, and it is important for us, right? We have a huge population. And because of the pandemic, because of the economic downturn across the world, we have kind of managed to, have a positive growth after the dip in the pandemic year. So I think it is very important. I think there is realization in the US that, what, our power is stretched. We require allies. We require partners. It reflects even in their documents. I mean, in the documents, they said we are willing to listen to the concerns of our friends, our partners, our allies. I mean, this is far cry from what the US used to do earlier, right? And they used to tell their allies, no, what, you're going for war, you have to join us.
Right.
It's not the case anymore. Today, even their allies are thinking, what, I mean, we had the French just recently say that, what, we're not going to follow the US everywhere.
Right.
So, yeah.
I mean, that famous George W. Bush statement that if you're not with us, you're against us, when it came to the Iraq war, still rankles amongst a lot of allies, I think. One of the, conversation points that you had mentioned earlier was how India's, closer relationship with the US could lead to India antagonizing Russia. Could you elaborate that on a bit and why this could not be as serious as the skeptics think it to be?
Our relations are independent for us. From our perspective, our relations with the US and our relationship with Russia have their own merit. Why would it antagonize Russia? I mean, first of all, you see Russia itself has not been too good with India in the last several years. Our relationship is very transactional. Remember, we started the conversation about transactionalism.
Right.
It's this relationship with Russia, which is so transactional, only limited to defense over the last 30 years, which is why today, there are such cracks. I mean, we might, issue a lot of statements which say nothing, all is good, but you look at everything, there are cracks. Russia is very close to China. I mean, a junior partner even now, very much under influence China. China can do a lot of things which will not be in our interest, in India's interest. You might tell Russia, what, you don't supply these weapons to India, or go slow over it, or give us some source codes. What, we are in our conflict with India and stuff like that. So it is going to affect us. So that way we don't have any leverage over Russia. But this partnership between Russia and China is not a very natural partnership. There are historic issues over that. They were not in the best of relations during the Soviet era. They signed this border agreement. All that is there. But even after that, China is an expansionist power. It claims a lot of Russian territory even today, and it's just biding its time because of its huge population. It can just go and populate the far east of Russia, which is already happening. The Russians do have concerns in that regard, and that's the reason why they were looking up to India to, and we formed this Chennai-Vladivostok link and all. But it's too, I mean, they are in a very difficult position themselves, and we don't have much leverage because China has a lot of leverage over Russia. But in due course, I think as India's economy grows, as our military power grows, I think we will be able to get some of that leverage back. But at the moment, I think our relations are a collateral damage of the geopolitics that we are living in, right? But I'll tell you, Russia has not been kind to us in the last so many years. If you look at how it has sided with China, or China took India to, tried to take India to the UN Security Council over Kashmir and Article 370 when we removed that. How it treated India during the conversations that were happening over Afghanistan, kept India out of those conversations. You have the foreign minister come to India and tell that, the relation between China and Russia is the best in the history. I mean, you come to India and tell us your relation with China, our greatest rival, or, just as we were in the conflict, we lost our soldiers in Galwan. And you have Lavrov come over here and tells, our relations are best in history. I mean, what is
Yeah.
But what has happened is post the Ukraine war, Russia has kind of been knocked into its senses too, because India has held its independent position and India has acted in the self-interest. I mean, we wanted cheap oil. It's as simple as that. I mean, it doesn't matter what else. I mean, we wanted cheap oil. We got the cheap oil. But what did it tell Russia? You know what? India is far more important, and we have been, messing around with them for a long time now.
And
that's the reason why
India
those
used
statements and a lot
those
of high-level
words.
decisions
India
have
used those words. This is not the time for war, which none of the even Western countries managed to do. Right? I mean, it also displays how India has grown in stature in terms of its relationships with various political blocs.
I think this is the most important point. We have to approach the world as the fifth largest economy in the world, which will be the third largest economy in the world in 3, 4, 5 years. We cannot think like the India of the last century, where we were weak, we were economically weak, militarily weak. It's a different India. We have to think like a big power or an aspiring big power. There is a lot of this commentary that happens, since betrays a sense of, inferiority complex. You're thinking like the India of the last century. You have to think like a big power. I mean, you have enormous influence, you're wielding enormous influence. A lot of things in the world cannot move without India's agreement. Something like climate change. Can there be any agreement on climate change without India? It cannot be there. Can the Indo-Pacific be Indo-Pacific without India? It cannot. India is a very important power, and we have to use that to our advantage. And we have to consider ourselves as someone who is speaking to the world from position of strength, or position of equality. We cannot be, thinking like India of the world, like I said. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. So, in all these conversations that happen, we have to understand that we are a $3.5 trillion economy, which will be a $5 trillion economy, will be a $10 trillion economy. Once we cross Japan, that position of number 1, 2, 3 economy in the world is going to stay for a very, very long time.
Indeed.
And yeah, we have to get out of this inferiority complex, is what I feel, when it comes to our conversations or our analysis of what India should do or what India is doing. And I think we are doing well. Even if you look at what Foreign Minister Jaishankar has been saying, I think some of his words and some of his work is pointing to this, right? We are in, whose side are you on? We are on our side. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
We are on our side because our side is very big. We are the largest population in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And
it's time that all these
ties in with everybody in the world, which says that we will work for our self-national interest. We're not working for the US or Europe or Russia or Japan or Southeast Asia. We are working for ourselves.
So every country works for itself. But then if your relative power is not there, you are a weaker nation. So even a compromise is in your national interest, right? Because you would weigh the consequences, you'll balance it all out and say, okay, I know what, I need to compromise over here, because if I say no, it's going to hurt me. So that is your national interest, right? It's like Musharraf taking the decision to help the US with the war in Afghanistan, because the US said it will bomb you to the Stone Age.
Right.
So in its national interest, not getting bombed into Stone Age, Musharraf decided, let's help the US in this war. But then it played tricks for over the next 20 years and undermined the US effort in Afghanistan in whatever ways it could. But if you are a big power, you are going to compromise a lot less. And secondly, if you make any compromise, it's going to be only after you gain something out of it. We are going to give you this, but we expect this in return. So this is how big powers will come. So India is doing that, right? Today we talk about, say, free trade agreement. We ask, we have this bunch of talented citizen that we have. We need jobs and you need to give us visas in return for a free trade agreement. So this is how we talk. We're not talking from a position of weakness. We are talking from a position of strength as an equal. If it's not happening, then we just walk away from it. Simple.
Right. On that note, Yusuf, thank you very much. We've come to the end of our time. It was really an interesting discussion. I urge our listeners to go to the Takshashila website and read through Yusuf's very, very important paper on assessing US-India relations. It will be up soon. I hope that we continue this discussion later also once we get feedback from our readers. Thank you once again, Yusuf. It was great talking to you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sachin. Thanks. It was great to talk with you today. Thanks so much.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.